Dear colleagues, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this online meeting of the Mediterranean and Middle East Special Group. I'm delighted for us to have the opportunity to meet today, if only virtually, and I hereby declare the meeting officially open. I'm very happy to have Mr. Ben Bouled from Algeria and Mr. Azri from Morocco joining us today. Your comments and your perspective on the topics that we will be discussing will always, of course, be very educational for us, and I thank you very much for this engagement with us today. Our topic today is Iraq. First of all, you will hear two excellent briefings, Madame Ashamari and Ambassador Silliman. I welcome you both. Our rapporteur, Mr. John Carr, will also present the draft report. Dear Berat, this report, I'm quite convinced, will spark a very interesting discussion. A few practical guidelines from the outset. You can find this report online on the NPA site. You can find the report there as well as today's agenda. You can find them, in fact, on the Kudo platform. If you look on the right-hand side under Documents on your screen, you can find the documents there. We have a very ambitious agenda today, and we will do our best to finish on time. A few practical considerations. Please use a headset with a built-in microphone if you intend to take the floor today. Your smartphone headset, such as I'm using, are suitable as well, but if you do have poor equipment, this leads to very bad sound for the interpreters, amongst others. So please do your best to have suitable equipment. What's even more important is that we don't use headsets with microphones. This can lead to a risk of serious injury for the interpreters' eardrums because of the great differences in sound levels. So thank you in any case for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on your geographic location. If you'd like to take the floor, please click on Request the Floor in the lower corner of your screen. And if you have any difficulties during the meeting, please use the operator message box, and the NPA staff will do their best to help you out if you experience any difficulties. And now I'm asking the GSM members, and only the GSM members, to turn their attention to the agenda. I have a few questions. Do you have any specific comments to make? Any objections to the draft agenda? I'm looking to see if anyone's requesting the floor. I don't see any. No requests for the floor. Thank you very much. The agenda is therefore adopted, and it is now my honor to give the floor to the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, who is honoring us with his presence here today, Mr. Gerald Connolly, who will make a few remarks. President, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, dear Sonia, for giving us this opportunity to say a few words as you begin deliberations today on the subject of Iraq. The Mediterranean and Middle East Special Group provides a very critical forum to discuss developments in the Middle East and Africa region and to enhance cooperation and dialogue with our partners throughout the region. I know that through these discussions, you aim to build trust and understanding and ultimately to foster a greater peace, stability, and development in the region that so desperately needs it. I'd also like to thank you for your important contribution and to extend a warm welcome in particular to our partners from Morocco and Algeria who are attending today's session. I also want to give special thanks, of course, to you, Sonia, for your enthusiastic and able leadership of this group, and to Berat for his report on Iraq. Thank you as well to Dr. Al-Shamari and Ambassador Silliman for sharing their expertise with our members today. In today's complex security environment, members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and lawmakers from the Middle East and Africa can learn from each other and work to address the many challenges we confront together. These include, among others, the persistent terrorist threat, Iran's nuclear ambition and destabilizing role throughout the region, the devastating consequences of civil war in Syria and Yemen, and a huge refugee flood as a consequence, and of course, the ongoing issue of instability in Libya. Of course, today, the discussion focuses on Iraq. Iraq's recent history is tragic, and the country continues to face serious challenges. Daesh remains a persistent and much weakened presence, and Iran's proxies regularly target coalition troops while seeking to rally the Iraqi public against any foreign presence in Iraq. At the same time, as Bharat's report shows, Iraqi authorities are demonstrating renewed will to tackle some of those challenges and, importantly, to address their citizens' own demands for a more inclusive political system, a more diversified economy, and for tackling rampant corruption. In turn, our nations have affirmed their commitment to help Iraq to achieve a greater degree of security and reconciliation. And the recent NATO summit has confirmed the Allies' decision to expand capacity building support for Iraq in full respect for Iraq's sovereignty and at Iraq's own request. It's a further positive signal that you put Iraq at the center of your agenda today. Before concluding, let me add one important clarification regarding U.S. support for Iraq. You may have heard that the United States House of Representatives recently voted to repeal the authorization for the use of military force in Iraq. I strongly supported that decision, which puts an end to an open-ended legislation our Congress passed under very different circumstances in the post-9/11 environment. This decision is not about our support for Iraq, which remains. It's about the legislative branch, Congress's constitutional responsibility and power to regulate the use and deployment of military force. The AUMF was passed 19 years ago and is no longer justified nor necessary for the United States to continue supporting Iraq. With this, let me end here, Sonia, and wish you fruitful discussions. I will at some point have to get off because for good reason, we're actually having a NATO Parliamentary Assembly hearing, the first one ever that I know of in the Congress, to talk about NATO and the future of NATO and the alliance. And certainly I will keep in mind your discussions about Iraq during that hearing. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your leadership. And thanks everyone for participating today. I look forward to hearing as much as I can of the discussion. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President. Indeed, we will move on now to item 3 of our agenda. I am now asking GSM members to adopt the summary of our previous meeting held on the 11th of December 2020. Do any members wish to make any comments? Once again, you have the documents on the right-hand side under Documents on the Kudo screen. Any comments? I don't see anyone requesting the floor. So everyone's happy with our work. I'd like to thank you all, and our report of our previous meeting is therefore adopted. Very good. Dear colleagues, we come now to item 4 of the agenda, our discussion panel on the future of Iraq. Before listening with great interest to our rapporteur, I will introduce our panel on security, stabilization, and reconciliation. Without further ado, I will introduce very briefly our 2 speakers, Ambassador Douglas Silliman, who is president of the Washington Institute of Gulf Arab States in Washington. Ambassador, I won't delve into your long resume of all the missions that you've taken, your various postings, and you were in Iraq from 2016 to 2019 as ambassador, previously in Kuwait from 2014 to 2016. From 2013 to 2014, you were chief advisor to the Bureau of Middle Eastern Affairs of the State Department. You were in Ankara in Baghdad from 2011 to 2012, head of mission in Ankara from 2008 to 2011. And then we will hear Ms. Mahseen Ashamari, who is in charge of a postdoctoral research project. She did previously pre-doctoral research. Currently, she is working in the foreign policy program of the Brookings Institute. Her research deals with Iraqi politics, relations between Iraq and the United States, Shia political activism, and other different topics. She is also working on a book looking at the role played by Shia religious officials during the protest movements in Iraq over the past century. Thank you both for taking part in our panel today. We'll start with Ambassador Silliman. I will give you the floor straight away.
Madam Chairperson, members of the Mediterranean and Middle East Special Group, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here this morning. Good afternoon to you, and a good morning to a person I consider Congressman Connolly, who represents the district just to the west of mine near Washington, D.C. I was very happy to see President Connolly joining this group for a time this morning. It's a great honor to speak to you today. As the chairperson mentioned, I've spent 5 of the last 10 years of my life serving as an American diplomat in Iraq, including as the ambassador from 2016 to 2019. And I'm hoping that my experience on the ground can help you understand the challenges in Iraq, what is at stake, and what NATO and its member states may be able to do collectively and individually to help rectify an unstable security situation. But before I dive into the security situation in Iraq, permit me to talk a bit about Iraq's population and society, because it's necessary to understand what we're talking about. First, Iraq's social contract with its population is different than that in most of the West. Iraq is a rentier state in which the state has traditionally used state revenues, in recent decades almost entirely derived from the sale of oil, to provide jobs and services in exchange for the loyalty and the quiescence of the population. This model has worked fairly well in other rentier state economies in the region with large revenue streams and smaller populations, places like Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. But Iraq has nearly 40 million people, and the government does not have the resources to provide the services that those people expect: education, electricity, water, jobs, and security. Second, Iraq is a country with a very young population. According to both the UN and the CIA, the median age in Iraq is somewhere between 20 and 21 years old. That means that about half of Iraqis are under the age of 20 and about half are over the age of 20. To put this in context, the median age in Turkey is 29, in the United States is 37, and in Germany it is 45. Iraq's young population can provide energy, innovation, and growth if that youthful energy can be loosed and directed into productive areas. But it also means that the demands of the growing youth population for government jobs and for government services is already accelerating faster than the Iraqi government can supply them. Third, Iraqi society is riven with social fault lines that are reflected in politics, in the economy, and in the country's security. The one most people talk about is a division between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. This is certainly a fault line, but not the only one. Other significant social divisions are between Arabs and Kurds and other minorities like Yezidis and Christians, between urban populations and rural populations, between those who accept legislative justice and those who accept tribal justice, between the educated and the less well-educated, and between those with a secular orientation and those who are more religious. Some of these divisions reinforce each other's, and some are more cross-cutting. But these three social phenomenon, a dominant rentier state mentality, a growing and dissatisfied youth population, and deep ethnic and sectarian and social divisions have had a profound impact on Iraq's security. So let me address those issues now a bit more directly. The different ways that groups have used to gain political and economic power in Iraq have led to the creation of competing and sometimes violent political, tribal, and sectarian movements with distinct and exclusionary narratives that justify that group's attempts to accumulate power and resources to itself. These narratives led to the creation of Al-Qaeda and later the Islamic State. They have permitted a bleed over across the Turkish border and the creation of a long-term PKK base in the mountains of northern Iraq. They have spawned violence among Muslims as well as violence among tribal and ethnic groups. But more important than all of that, those divisions have led to competition among and the sectarianization of different parts of Iraq's already fragmented security apparatus. Iraq's security forces are truly fractured. Officially sanctioned and supported Iraqi security forces include traditional forces like the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Counterterrorism Service, and the Federal Police, but they also include the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and a number of various civilian, military, and PMF intelligence units. The PMF and the Peshmerga are further divided internally by party, by ideology, by individual leadership, and by geography. There has also been significant outside sponsorship of security forces, which has tended to deepen the existing divisions and, in some cases, has sought to exploit those divisions. Now, the United States, NATO members, and NATO itself supports the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Counterterrorism Service, and the Peshmerga. Iran supports the Popular Mobilization Forces and a number of unsanctioned non-PMF militias. In addition to these divisions within the formal Iraqi security forces, there are also quite a few groups that simply do not recognize the legitimacy of the government in Baghdad and use violence and coercion to pursue their own ends. These forces include terrorist groups, violent organized criminal gangs, parts of the Popular Mobilization Forces, and most of the shadowy Shia militias that live half inside and half outside the formal structures of the security forces. So what has the impact of these divisions in Iraqi society and among security forces meant for Iraq? Terrorism is one result. And this terrorism has been compounded by policies pursued since 2003 by largely Shia-led governments in Baghdad that have alienated many Sunni Arabs, many others as well, but particularly Sunni Arabs. Many Sunni Arabs in the north and west of Iraq feel disenfranchised and disconnected from and distrustful of their central government. And frankly, as ISIS charged across the Syrian border into Iraq in 2014 and 2015, many Sunni tribal leaders and citizens trusted neither ISIS nor the government in Baghdad. Instead of actively opposing ISIS, they chose to sit on the sidelines and not pick a side at all. I remember all too well the determined but poorly armed ISIS assaults into Iraq in 2014 and the way that the well-equipped but poorly disciplined Iraqi army collapsed in the face of those attacks. However, since then, I can report that with the assistance of the members of the coalition to defeat ISIS and the NATO mission in Iraq, the army and other traditional Iraqi security forces have made great strides. They can now plan for and conduct worthwhile counterinsurgency operations, effectively integrate Iraqi air power into ground operations, mix different types of intelligence into the planning process, and more effectively conduct a complete intelligence cycle. That is, make a raid, exploit the site for intelligence and knowledge, build a follow-on plan, execute a new raid, and start the cycle over again. Yet, even with these advances, today pockets of ISIS remain dangerous, particularly in the spaces between the deployed Iraqi army, the Peshmerga, and the Popular Mobilization Forces. The divisions and distrust among these forces have made it harder to plan, implement, and sustain counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations in these sometimes kilometers-wide seams, giving ISIS the ability to retreat, regroup, win propaganda victories, and live to fight another day. Ethnic and sectarian divisions have also frequently spilled over into sectarian violence. Shia tribes and Shia militias, angered by the killing of Shia in terrorist attacks over the past 2 decades, have cleansed large parts of central and northern Iraq of their long-settled Sunni populations. In northwest Iraq, ISIS captured, killed, or drove away tens of thousands of Yezidis whom they considered heretics. Many Iraqi Christians who saw how ISIS treated the Yezidis fled their historic towns and villages before ISIS arrived. And today, Shia militias have set up shop in the Sunni heartland in central, western, and northern Iraq, even in the city of Mosul. This presence is stoking tensions with the local population and, I fear, could lead to future extremist violence. The government in Baghdad has thus far been powerless to stop or reverse this trend. And unfortunately, the fragmentation of Iraqi politics and security forces has given Iran a foothold in Iraq through the funding, training, and arming of sectarian militias, many of which have been incorporated into the popular mobilization forces, which are legally a part of the security forces and receive funding from the Iraqi government. Many of these groups often refer to themselves as the axis of resistance. And many of these militias actively support Iran's strategic objectives in Iraq and the broader region. For example, the PMF and PMF-associated groups actively support the Assad regime in Syria. They train Arabic-speaking militants and terrorists from Gulf states, Yemen, and farther afield. They assist in the transport of weapons, including sophisticated missiles, from Iran across Iraq into Syria and Lebanon. This has led to hundreds of Israeli airstrikes along supply routes in Syria and, on occasion, inside Iraq. This militia activity could eventually draw Iraq into a war with Israel that most Iraqis want nothing to do with. And most recently, as President Connolly mentioned, the Iran-sponsored militias have conducted frequent rocket and drone attacks against Iraqi bases that house American and other coalition military forces in an attempt to force an end to the Western military presence, but also to end Western military assistance to the parts of the security forces that remain loyal to Baghdad. It is clear to me that Iran and the popular mobilization forces largely seek to supplant the traditional security forces of Iraq and be the primary provider of internal and external security for the country. Iran and their Iraqi allies are trying to replicate in Iraq the model of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is nothing less than a threat to the very basis of democratic governance in Iraq that the vast majority of Iraqis and the international community, including NATO members, support. NATO and the NATO mission in Iraq can assist the Iraqi security forces that have remained loyal to the government through continued training and mentoring, and I'm very pleased to see that the NATO mission is continuing forward. And individual NATO member states should also continue their own bilateral assistance to the forces that are loyal to the government. However, training and security assistance alone will not stabilize Iraq. Stability will also require significant economic reform, a serious campaign against government corruption and nepotism, and a more serious focus by the international community on human security in Iraq. I mentioned earlier that the median age in Iraq is just over 20 years old. This largest cohort of youth in Iraq's history is growing up, graduating from secondary school and university, and looking for jobs. Starting in about 2023, 1 million young Iraqis will enter the job market every year, but the government-provided jobs that most expect to receive simply do not exist. It is no wonder that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, mostly young Shia, have been demonstrating since 2018 for jobs, better government services, and a feeling of national belonging and identity. Since 2019, those demonstrations have been met with violence, including violent dispersal of protests, live firing on protesters, and, more recently, assassinations of protest leaders, almost certainly by Shia militias. Without economic reform aimed at controlling corruption, facilitating foreign investment, and, most importantly, prioritizing domestic Iraqi investment, entrepreneurship, and business creation, Iraq's unemployed and disaffected youth population will continue to grow, and we are likely to see continued poverty, protests, and political instability. In a worst-case scenario, especially if Iraq's sectarian divisions grow, militia assassinations of protest leaders continue, if the ideas of the protests are not incorporated into the results of upcoming parliamentary elections, and if militias gain control of key economic levers, as has been the case of the IRGC in Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, there is real potential for widespread despair and pressure for mass migration from Iraq, not unlike what we have seen in the past decade from Syria. My intent today is not to predict a doomsday scenario in Iraq, but merely to lay out what might be at stake. Iraq is not a problem to be fixed, but a mixture of contradiction and opportunity that will require continued international attention and crisis management in both the security and economic sectors. Iraq sits at the historic center of civilization in the Middle East and is a crossroad for goods, capital, information, and migration for Asia, Africa, and Europe. And what happens in Iraq does not stay in Iraq. Instability there can breed instability in Iraq's neighbor, is already doing so in Syria and Lebanon, and increasingly poses a threat to Israel and Gulf Arab states. By the same token, increased stability in Iraq and expanded international concern about broader stability and prosperity in Iraq can help calm other potential hotspots in the region as well. NATO and NATO member states can and should play a crucial but limited role as part of a larger international effort to help Iraq heal itself. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Ambassador. The floor now goes to Dr. Al-Shamari. You have the floor, madam. We are very eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you to all those present, to President Connolly and everyone for the very kind invitation to speak here today. It's an honor to speak alongside Ambassador Suleiman today. His remarks on social divisions in Iraq and foreign intervention are critical to understanding the political dynamics and the potential future scenarios that the country is facing. I've had the opportunity to read the excellent preliminary draft report on the future of Iraq that was circulated ahead of this meeting, and I found it to be an excellent briefing on the state of affairs. I'd like to build on the report and on the ambassador's excellent remarks to provide a few insights of my own that are critical to understanding more of the internal dynamics, particularly around reconciliation and the dangers of not achieving a national dialogue in Iraq. Specifically, I would like to discuss 3 issues with all of you today. First is the lack of national dialogue in Iraq and the repercussions of that. Second, authoritarian nostalgia that is rising in Iraq and what that can mean. And finally, the upcoming elections in October 2021 and the boycott movement that looks to be working alongside of them. So in Ambassador Suleiman's remarks, he ended on a somber note, cautioning that human security issues in Iraq could lead to a situation of migration and instability much like that of Syria. And I agree that the dire economic situation in Iraq is certainly true and certainly a powerful motivator. And we also know that economic hardship, particularly coupled with a young population, that, as previously mentioned, the average age is 21, so a very, very young population. These often lead to cycles of violence, these 2 factors. This is an established fact in the social sciences. However, to me, what is most alarming is that the root cause of the cycles of violence haven't been addressed, and they've been left to fester. What I mean by that is that every single community in Iraq has been, at some point in its history, a target of oppression. And at the same time, many communities in Iraq have at the same time been perpetrators of violence and repression. In each of these instances, we as Iraqis haven't engaged in meaningful reconciliation and national dialogue, and we've left these wounds open to ultimately result in other waves of violence, with more communities feeling neglected and more feeling oppressed. We can go very far back in history, or we can look at more recent events to understand how this works. For example, you can consider the trauma that Saddam Hussein caused the Kurdish community, including his genocidal campaign in Halabja. We haven't engaged in any meaningful Arab-Kurdish dialogues to address this, and Arab-Kurdish relations, both at the government level but even at the social level, continue to be strained. We can go back even further to Iraq's monarchy, which massacred Assyrians, and we haven't had a meaningful conversation about this. Rather, we watched, after 2003, the country was stripped of its Christian population, and it took the Pope's visit to remind people of historic events. Similarly, Saddam Hussein in the 90s targeted the Shia population and stripped Iraqis of Iranian origins of their nationality, of their property, and of their rights. And this hasn't been addressed in Iraq either. Rather, we have seeds of racism and bigotry that were sown by previous governments and by current governments, and no one has bothered to hold meaningful dialogue among key communities about them. This form of racism was rooted in Iraqi culture because Saddam Hussein was injecting it into the social fabric of society. And so long as we are not intentional about removing it and addressing it and making sure other seeds of racism and bigotry aren't planted, we have to contend with them in our society. In 2006, we had a sectarian civil war, which, as a political scientist, I will tell you, it fortunately ended very quickly. It resolved much faster than civil wars normally do. But after the Civil War, we didn't have an intersect dialogue to address what happened, to address death squads and suicide bombings in the country. We're fortunate today that Shia youth who are leading protest movements have signaled a clearly anti-sectarian agenda. But this isn't due to a national dialogue as much as it's due to exhaustion with the sectarian politics of today. Genocidal groups like ISIS, sectarian armed factions that prey on minorities, they don't arise in a vacuum. They arise from the combination of aggrieved communities whose victimization hasn't been addressed and by the hopelessness of youth poverty and unemployment. A large part of building a nation is healing it. Many countries in NATO are themselves very diverse and very aware of what it takes to create a national identity around historical trauma. In Iraq, we need to respect that. One of the aspects of the report that really resonated with me is a rejection of the idea that Iraqi nationalism is weak or that Iraq is a fragmented, unreal state. Iraq is a diverse state, as many others are. And nationalism, as Benedict Anderson says in his book, is about an imagined community and about a national story. So Iraq has a cultural capital and resources to accomplish this, so long as we don't ignore our history and engage in national dialogue. One of the repercussions of not doing so isn't only cycles of violence, as we have witnessed, but it's also space for resurgence of authoritarianism. One of the key points I want to raise today is that public opinion in Iraq is reaching a very dangerous precipice, which is fueled by the lack of basic historic, civic, and political education. As was previously mentioned by the ambassador, Iraq has a very young population, and it's rapidly growing. In 2003, there were 25 million Iraqis. Today, there are nearly 40 million. This means the average Iraqi was 3 years old when the Ba'ath regime was deposed. They have no idea what Iraq was like before 2003. They have no access to Iraq's history because the government hasn't invested in historic memory through a museum, for example. This is why things like the Halabja Memorial or Nadia Murad's book, The Last Girl, are very important, but they also need to be put in the public eye. Individuals who have no memory of life under authoritarianism tend to have, and this is across all countries, not just Iraq, they tend to have a higher expectation of democracy and a rosier view of authoritarianism, viewing it as stable and viewing stability and freedom as a trade-off. For example, we saw that in Brazil, people voted for Bolsonaro, forgetting the military dictatorship he came from. In Peru, we saw a former dictator's daughter running for office and losing narrowly, just as we see Saddam Hussein on television giving interviews trying to rewrite Iraqi history. Iraqis today frequently refer to Saddam's era as being better. They say they're willing to tolerate a strong man, that democracy isn't working for them. But most of them haven't seen Saddam Hussein's authoritarianism. In the protest movement, we witnessed the most nuanced conversations about politics, but even then, there was a dangerous tendency of wanting a presidential system, not realizing perhaps that presidential systems empower individuals with much less constraints than parliamentary ones. But who can blame the average Iraqi for espousing these thoughts? The education system in Iraq doesn't provide for civic education or political education in a meaningful way. It doesn't perform in a way that inspires support for democracy or that gives individuals the tools to understand how true democracies function and what their value is. This is another danger in Iraq. The specter of authoritarianism that's supported by the public that supports the public means for populists. In my opinion, this stems not only from poor government performance, but also a lack of education that allows citizens to better identify ways to demand the change they desire. The final point I want to raise today, the third of my main points, is how this lack of faith in the political system and democracy overall will translate on the ground today. As you all know, Iraq will have early elections in October 2021. They were demanded by the protesters in 2019. At the same time, we're seeing that the very same protesters who asked for these early elections are now planning a boycott movement. Not only a boycott of people who vote, but also a boycott of the political parties who came out of the protests, who are now refusing to even run in elections. There were a handful of these parties that formed after October 2019. They had a vision of a civic, sometimes secular, is what they'll say, Iraq, one that isn't run by a sectarian quota system, and one that is rooted in nationalism and meritocracy and technocracy, is their vision of Iraq. They also requested international involvement to make sure the elections are free and fair, and the UN surprisingly has decided to provide election day monitoring. Despite all of these, their requests, despite the monitoring, their requests really haven't been met, and they have stated that they are likely, or they will be boycotting, most of them, the elections. In 2018, we had a boycott movement in Iraq as well, but it arose in a different situation. It arose from the lack of faith in the system. And it was aided inadvertently by a statement released by the religious establishment saying that people could vote or couldn't vote. It was up to them, which people interpreted as not needing to vote. The results of the boycott of 2018 were disastrous. They empowered the populists and made the share of the pie much bigger for them. This time, it's not just the lack of faith in the political system, but an environment of deep insecurity. Activists point out to me in interviews that certain parties with armed wings, armed factions not directly under the Iraqi security forces, are behaving with impunity, assassinating activists, creating an atmosphere of fear, and toying with the pre-electoral environment. Most recently, the murder of an activist in the city of Karbala has actually led all the protest-based parties to declare that they won't be running anymore. They will be boycotting the election to strip the system of its legitimacy. In my opinion, in this situation, the best solution is the empowerment of the traditional Iraqi security forces and the non-traditional but very well-respected counterterrorism forces. And I can answer later why I think they're non-traditional. This is where NATO is critical and key. Iraq will only be able to secure a democratic environment which allows citizen participation in nationalist and non-predatory security forces, which are well-trained and well-equipped, are the ones in control of providing security. It may seem like a very difficult task to do so, but I can't emphasize enough that traditional forces like the Iraqi security forces and the counterterrorism forces enjoy credibility from the population, and we shouldn't lose or sacrifice this credibility because we can't take it for granted. This is where Iraq needs help from its friends and supporters. I'd like to conclude my talk today by reminding everyone present that what's at stake in Iraq is democracy in a region which lacks it. It's not easy to build democracy, and it takes generations. This is what we've seen in other countries. And there's many ways in which it can be attacked and it is being stifled. You can curtail the freedom of speech. There's insecure pre-electoral environment. There's creating conditions in which the public is dissatisfied enough to want authoritarianism. In this situation, Iraq should avoid shortcuts and should do the hard work of having difficult conversations. Iraq's friends and supporters should continue to work on empowering nationalist state institutions and security forces in order to promote a sovereign, free, and safe Iraq that does not prey on its citizens and that does not erase the historic memory of communities that have been preyed upon previously. The only way for Iraq to move forward peaceably, in my opinion, is to make peace with and recognize its past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci. Merci de vos...
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you to both of you. I'm going to now open up the floor without further ado, so I'll give the floor to colleagues who want to ask questions at this stage. So we'll launch the Q&A session. So let me see if anyone is asking for the floor.
Roxandra Papa.
OK.
Merci
Madame
beaucoup.
Popa, à vous la parole.
Merci
Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
our two guest speakers for what I found absolutely fascinating presentations. Thanks a lot for sharing your insights with us. I have lots of questions, but I'll try to ask one for each of you. First, Ambassador Siliman, and indeed Dr. Al-Shamari, perhaps you could share some of your views as well on just the impact of current sort of US-Iranian talks as well as elections, presidential elections in Iran on dynamics in Iraq and Iran's relations with Iraq going forward. So how do you view the prospect for Iranian-Iraqi relations going forward? And then a second question, Dr. Al-Shamari, about your plea for indeed a national dialogue in Iraq as a key element for the society to sort of come together. What would you say is a good example that Iraq can look towards for a national dialogue, and what those young people in Iraq, when they look up to a model somewhere else, what do they see as a successful example of a country that has undergone the type of conflict situations and foreign intervention that Iraq has had, and that has come out of that as a positive example? Thank you very much.
Thank you for those excellent questions. And I hesitate to speak on behalf of Iraqis, especially with Dr. Al-Shamari here in the conversation. What I would like to say in terms of U.S.-Iraq dynamics and Iran-Iraq dynamics, most Iraqis with whom I speak are horrified by the fact that American-Iranian competition seems to be taking place on Iraqi territory. I think they think more of it is taking place than actually is, but one of Iran's main strategic goals in the region is to reduce and eventually eliminate American and other Western military forces from the region. And Iraq is the place where Iran has the greatest, other than Lebanon or potentially Syria, has the greatest influence on forces that they have helped create to reduce the military presence. I remember back to the very first protests in 2018 that started in the city of Basra in the south. There was a very anti-Iranian and anti-militia tinge to those demonstrations. The demonstrators actually sacked and burned the Iranian consulate in Basra and the offices of many of the Shia militias that they felt were repressing them. I am afraid that the American killing of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes in January of last year, 2020, reminded Iraqis that the United States also has the power to intervene directly in areas that Iraqis would not like to see us intervene. But I get the impression that the degree to which Iranian influence in militias and in criminal gangs has crept into all parts of society, particularly in the south of Iraq, is again turning public opinion tide against Iran in a way I hope that leaves out the idea of the United States. I will also say that there are significant portions of the Iraqi population that not only don't want to see the United States and NATO in Europe leave, they want to see the presence increased. This is a lot of Sunnis, most Kurds, the vast majority of Yezidis and Christians and other groups who feel that, as I said in my remarks, the government no longer is looking after the good of communities other than the Shia community. So I kind of skirted around your question there, and I'll let Dr. Shamri address what Iraqis actually think of American-Iranian competition in the country, but I think it's an excellent, excellent question.
Yes, it is an excellent question. And I will say to Ambassador Suleiman's comment that even as an Iraqi, I feel like I can't speak on behalf of so many Iraqis because of the diversity of opinions here. And I am always taken by surprise at the things I learned from being in Baghdad and being in Iraq. So I will answer the question with the caveat that I am not a public opinion survey of Iraq, though I think those are very valuable. With regards to U.S.-Iranian relations, it's exactly true. They have been the specter that haunts every Iraqi and something that makes everyone feel entirely powerless because there's nothing that any individual Iraqi and frankly Iraqi government can do about the repercussions of U.S.-Iranian relations on the state of affairs in Iraq. So for the most part, I think people have just come to terms that this is their reality. I do think attention is paid differently to U.S. and Iran depending on which faction of society and which group we're talking about. During the protests, Ambassador Suleiman's completely right. There was a very strong anti-Iranian sentiment. There wasn't an equally strong anti-American one. Iran was seen as the interventionist state in Iraq. The embassies and consulates were attacked, and the offices of Islamist parties that were seen to be affiliated with Iran were also attacked. And this happened in cities that were very, very Shia, like Najaf and Karbala, which are the centers of Shiism in Iraq. So this was an interesting turn of events in the country. With regards to the elections in Iran, from the Iraqi perspective, and I think from most of everyone who was following it, the results weren't surprising and everyone was getting acclimated to the reality fairly quickly. But the potential of the U.S. and Iran to sort out the JCPOA issues is a source of future hope for Iraqis watching this space. With regards to the second question about a good example for a national dialogue, I've given this some thought because it's one of the things that I personally would like to work on while I'm in Iraq. And, there's no one model fits all, but I see different examples from different countries. And I think, taking bits of this and bits of that would be useful for us. It's genuinely very basic things, and we have already existing the tools for them. So, one example that I'm a very big proponent of is just having a museum of national memory that school children can visit. That just doesn't cover what happened in the last 10 or 20 years, but goes back 100 years and talks about how different communities have suffered decades ago, and no other community has heard about this suffering. Just creating an understanding that most Iraqi communities have been victims at some point, and the state has been oppressive for most of Iraqi history. And I think if everyone came to realize that in Iraq, it would go a long way towards creating an Iraqi identity, perhaps a we're all oppressed identity, but it's still a unified one. Germany, for example, has excellent museums. The museum in the U.S., the African American Museum, is an amazing museum. So just simple things like that. In terms of dialogue, there's institutions worldwide that have already started to do some training, but on a very small scale in Iraq. Personally, I've seen training and dialogue using clerics, who are very powerful actors in Iraqi society and bringing different religious actors together. And I found those conversations to be difficult but quite useful. So escalating that up, critically including more youth and putting it into the education system. Maybe I'm going into too many details. So something as simple as making Nadia Murad's book a required reading for all Iraqi high schoolers would go a long way for this. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your answers. I'm now going to give the floor to Paolo Formentini, who wants to ask a question. Paolo, you have the floor.
Indeed, I have two questions. The first one is a geopolitical one. How do you foresee the increased or not, this is a question, presence of China and Russia in Iraq, and how dangerous is the strategic agreement between Iran and China for the next 25 years for the region? And the second one instead is linked to what the ambassador said about the diminished presence of Christian communities in Iraq. 20 years ago, we had nearly 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Now, only 300,000, 400,000 of them remain. How can we restore hope as NATO? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I'm just checking if there are other questions, if you don't mind. Mr. Ambassador, I have a question myself, and I see someone else wants to ask a question. Yes, so I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Chonkar.
I just would like to learn more about the performance of the Prime Minister Al-Kazimi's government in Iraq. Is he providing the ground for the national reconciliation, and how has his performance been up to now? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give the floor to one last speaker for a last question, if you don't mind. So I'll give the floor to Madame Cantera.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi pregunta era más dirigida un poco al contexto del feminismo. My question has to do with feminism. Can you hear the interpreter now? Yes, hello. Very good afternoon. I will speak in Spanish. My question is for both speakers. I have very much liked both your presentations. How do you see, from your different perspectives and experiences, do you think that women are going to be more incorporated to the reality of Iraq? How are we going to make progress in the incorporation to the administrations, to the political framework? Do you think that there might be a setback to the ideas or the footprint left in this sense by the foreign troops regarding the incorporation of women to society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you for your question. We talked about reconciliation, Iran, Christians present in Iraq, and some very excellent questions, especially at the end on women. So you have the floor to answer.
Maybe, Madam Chairperson, I will start with the first questions from Paolo Fantini. There is significant investment by China and penetration of China into Iraq's economy. Part of this is because part of China's international development strategy is granting of easy credit. And frankly, Chinese business practices are not necessarily always as straightforward and clean and legal as most of the West are. So China has in particular been a necessary partner in most of the development of Iraq's hydrocarbons in the south because Chinese companies are needed to provide international financing. They also provide equipment often at a lesser quality but a far lesser cost than many American, European, or other Western corporations. So I am a little bit concerned about the penetration of China into the economy. I think China's goal is not necessarily to help Iraq. China's goal is really to make sure that they have got influence and easy access to sources of hydrocarbons energy in the future so they can continue to develop and grow their economy and expand the size of their middle class and reduce poverty in China. A lot of reasons that have nothing to do with Iraq. Russia's influence has been a bit more insidious. I think Vladimir Putin in particular has tried to fill gaps like in Syria where he sees a weakness of Western influence, and I think he sees opportunities in Iraq. I have not yet found Iraqis as accepting of a Russian presence or influence as I have accepting of Chinese because of Chinese technology, although the Russians have pushed very hard and very corruptly in some cases to try to increase arms sales to the Iraqi security forces in Iraq. So those are a short answer to the first question. I spent much of my time as ambassador looking at the idea of the pressure on Iraqi minority communities, particularly Christians and Yezidis. The situations of those communities are very different, but mostly in the wake of the change of the regime in 2003, opportunities for Christians to easily migrate to Europe, North America, and developed Asia, particularly Australia. I have had dozens of conversations with Christian families which are split right down the middle. Half of them say, we must stay here. Christianity is a 2,000-year-old part of Iraq's history and society, and we must keep it alive and vibrant in Iraq. The other half of the family says, if my daughter goes to Adelaide, she can attend medical school and her life will be better. She will be treated differently in Australia or in Germany or in Canada than she is in Iraq. And how can I deny my children this opportunity to improve their lives, even though the community itself needs to stay here? This is a live debate, not only among Christian clergy, but inside families. And I don't think there's an easy resolution, probably until and unless something that Dr. Shimri suggested, there's a real reckoning with the history of Christianity, particularly the recent history and pressure on Christian communities. But this goes for Yezidis. In many ways, the Yezidis are less fortunate than the Christians. It's a much larger community. It also has had fewer opportunities for Yezidis to immigrate outside of Iraq, except for some of the women and children who've been most abused by Daesh, by ISIS. So these are very, very difficult questions that divide families in Iraq. And I don't know that there's an easy solution other than to expand economic opportunity and to begin a reconciliation process similar to what Dr. Shemri has suggested.
I will follow answers and I will just address the other two questions because I think you have sufficiently answered the first two. With regards to Prime Minister Kadami's performance, I'm the person who has written a lot about this, so I'm someone who keeps a tally of what I think of his performance thus far. So I can give you a very second answer to this. The first is I criticize him severely for weakening the Iraqi state. Particularly with what happened recently in Iraq in terms of arresting a PMF commander and then creating a standoff between the Iraqi security forces and the PMF. In the past, whenever anyone in the PMF were to be arrested or if they were to do anything, the PMF would distance themselves from them and say, oh, they're not really part of us. But now what ended up happening is he actually created the space for them to be oppositional to the security forces, something that I don't want to see happening in Iraq because it takes us a step further into violence. And that is my strongest criticism of his performance yet. And this is the second time that he has taken Iraq into this dangerous position and then retreated quickly and thereby weakened the Iraqi state and the appearance of the Iraqi security forces. With regards to the positives, particularly for national reconciliation, I will say that the Pope's visit to Iraq was hugely important for national dialogue. I mean, it created a day of national dialogue that was announced by the Prime Minister, but I think the credit for the Pope's visit goes to President Barham Saleh rather than the Prime Minister, to be entirely fair. That being said, the Prime Minister's office, when you speak to them, seem to be very open to the idea of national dialogue and investing in that. Words mean something, actions mean more, but I will try to be kind about this assessment by saying that. As for the question about feminism, which I hope I understood because I unfortunately do not speak Spanish, despite growing up in the US, But are women going to be more incorporated into Iraqi institutions, and just generally about the gender dynamics and feminism in the Iraqi state? I will say, as an Iraqi, I've just noticed such divergent roles for women in Iraqi society, and it really depends on social class, and it depends on rural-urban divides. In some parts of Baghdad, I genuinely see women as having more freedom than women in the U.S. in terms of just sometimes, particularly professional women in Iraq. I see them as having a surprising and counterintuitive amount of freedom and respect. But then you cast your glance just a little bit outside of this tiny circle, and particularly in rural areas, honestly, even in cities across the south, in tribal areas, the situation of women is terrible and getting worse. There's many reports on how bad it is, but the sad thing is that it's not even improving a little bit. It's getting worse. And for the most part, even the energy of civil society towards women, towards creating spaces for them, is centered on Baghdad. And recently more so on Mosul due to it coming out of a crisis, but very much not in the south, not in tribal areas in the west where it needs a lot of attention. So I hope that the focus to where it did more.
Madam Chairman, if I can make two quick comments on those last two questions, if you'd permit me. First of all, I know the Prime Minister quite well, as I have known, the last several Prime Ministers quite well. He has a very interesting history coming out of liberal political activism first, and then running the Iraqi intelligence service. So it's a combination you rarely see anywhere in the world. I personally like him, and I think that his heart is with an Iraqi identity that would be recognized by most of the youth in the South who are saying, Nuridu Watan, we want a homeland, we want a nation. He is very afraid of further dividing Iraq and does not want to be the spark for sectarian violence or a civil war. And I think that causes him some hesitation and indecision that Dr. Shamari referenced. I hope he is successful. I can think of very few other Iraqi politicians who I believe have a vision of Iraq that is as widely accepted as his is. I just don't know how effective a politician and bureaucratic fighter he can be. In terms of Iraqi feminism, I have met some incredibly powerful Iraqi women, maybe more so than I have in other places where I have served as a diplomat. And I would point to particularly some very good United Nations programs to try to empower women to go into social activism, into politics, into entrepreneurship, to build women as a broader part of Iraqi society, not simply to create politicians or political groups that are fighting for women's rights, but rather to try to integrate women more fully, particularly in urban areas, unfortunately, into the breadth of Iraqi society and the economy. So I know that many NATO member states participate in and support this UN program, and several UN states also have similar programs. I think they are valuable, and I think that it will be good to continue that kind of program into the future.
Okay,
Thank you. I'd like to thank you both. One final statement, and I'll ask you to be very brief, and I will myself ask you one final question, and then I will give you the floor to answer those last questions. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Douglas Silliman and Marcin Ashamari for their briefings, but I think it was more a diagnosis of the situation in Iraq than tangible proposals that they were making. And if I may, our desire, as far as Algeria is concerned, is to have strong UN resolutions that are fully implemented worldwide without exception, for instance, in Palestine or in the Western Sahara. Perhaps we could have avoided the current chaotic situation in Iraq if UN resolutions had been fully applied. However, reconciliation through inclusive dialogue amongst Iraqis of various religious and ethnic groups is vital to allow people to live together in peace and security, such as Algeria's policy. Thirdly, in order to foster that reconciliation, there needs to be investment and there needs to be win-win trade relations to the benefit of this country and other countries in the region. Thank you for giving me the floor for this somewhat pessimistic statement. No, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us today. And our session is far from over, and I think that our colleague Jonkar will go more into detail and make indeed concrete proposals, because here we're hearing from two experts who have provided their analysis, but before delving further into the subject, it was important for us as parliamentarians to hear from these two experts. I would like to put two final questions, if I may, because I feel that it's vital for Iraq to maintain its sovereignty and its dignity in the region, that its territorial integrity be upheld. The Prime Minister is advocating for a balanced diplomacy, and we welcomed the President of the Council of Representatives of Iraq in the French Parliament, and I think that was very important to have that sort of parliamentary dialogue. But what about the involvement of Gulf nations in Iraq in recent years? It's not something that we've spoken about at any length, and since the 80s and the 90s, much has changed. So according to you, are the Gulf states more present or less involved, and why? One last question. We haven't spoken much about ISIS. However, we do continue the struggle against ISIS because it remains the chief threat that has not disappeared, but simply been transformed. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, well,
Et vous avez 4 heures.
You have 4 hours. No, I'm joking. No, you have a few minutes.
First of all, Barakallahu Feek, Dr. Abdul Haq. I try not to be too prescriptive, but I believe it is crucial for NATO and the NATO mission in Iraq to continue to strengthen the legitimate security forces that support the elected government. That is the main idea that I wanted to convey today. Madam Chairman, for your two very good questions, the Gulf states have been variously engaged and disengaged from Iraq. Unfortunately, the one that has been most engaged has been Kuwait, partially because of Kuwait's experience with Iraq in 1990 and 1991, partially because of the inclination of the previous Emir Sabah al-Ahmed. They have provided the most assistance and the most political energy to help Iraqis feel a part of the neighborhood. Saudi Arabia, which is arguably the country that could do the most in the region to help Iraq, has alternately expanded trade and representation and then pulled it back, and have not been as determined as they could be to overcome the opposition to closer ties between Baghdad and Riyadh that is coming from some of the pro-Iranian factions. I think that as an American, we have tried to get Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan in particular more engaged economically in Iran to provide alternative outlets for Iraqi products and competition for Iranian imports to Iraq, to provide other, hopefully less corrupt avenues to export Iraqi oil and Iraqi goods through Jordan, through Saudi Arabia. These have been difficult because, for example, a new or renewed border crossing between Saudi Arabia and Iraq at Ar has been constructed on the Saudi side. The Iraqis have not done similarly on the Iraqi side. There have been discussions of a second border crossing farther down the border. And a number of Iraqi Shia militias have actively fired drones and missiles into Saudi Arabia. So there is also a part of Iraq which is associated with the security forces which have attacked Saudi Arabia, which has made this relationship politically much more difficult for Riyadh. And to be perfectly honest, the Saudis right now are much more focused on the more serious threat from Yemen and attacks from Yemen. They see the importance of Iraq, but they see a very difficult, decades-long struggle to develop Saudi influence, and it's going to take some time for that to materialize, I would say. Maybe.
Merci beaucoup. On termine par vous. Si...
Much, and you have the last word, Dr. Ashamari.
Thank you. Yes, I'll add a bit to relations with the Gulf, which is an excellent question. With Saudi Arabia, I think the most important potential relationship, it's been in the works for a long time. It started under Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, in which ties were started to be restored between the two countries, including opening an embassy and the like. So it's been the work of several administrations, but one of the issues in Iraq is that, this is a good problem to have, is that we change administrations. And so you take a step back and a step forward in terms of bringing back these long-standing relationships to neighboring countries. So I think the positive sign is that the political parties or entities that have made overtures and that have signaled their willingness to forge ties with the Gulf have tended to cross-sectarian. We've seen both Shia and Sunni parties, and we've seen someone like Muqtada Sadr make overtures towards Saudi Arabia. So it's a cross-sectarian issue, and I think that signals something positive. As for the second question, may I ask you to repeat it? Because I chose to listen in French to test my French speaking skill or listening skills and found them severely lacking.
Well, indeed. I would like to hear your perspective on the struggle against Daesh, ISIS. This is not something that we speak about much in the West anymore. We don't speak much about ISIS anymore. We've had COVID and other things. But currently, I feel that ISIS has not disappeared. It's simply transformed, and the international coalition, upon the invitation and to the benefit of Iraqi authorities, remains vital. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Thank you. And on the agreement, the Sinjar agreement, if you can tell me a few things.
I should not test my language skills and importance. But yes, the Daesh question, I agree with you entirely. The situation hasn't been resolved, and it continues to be a problem. We see, bits of violence. We saw the bombings in Baghdad a few months ago, and resurgence is said to be likely by many analysts who look at the situation. For that reason, important to empower traditional security forces and the counterterrorism services as much as possible. And that is the explicit direct way of dealing with Daesh. But the underlying ways that are equally important of dealing with Daesh is the things that I've been speaking of not creating the structural causes of needing, armed groups to arise, of violence to arise, of actually addressing the root issues. And perhaps some of these solutions take a long time and are idealistic, but to me they all go back to investing in Iraqi education, especially with such a youthful population. I'm trying to be very thorough in this answer, but very quick because I'm aware of it. So I hope that answers that.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to both of you. I'd like to thank everyone who asked questions as well. Ambassador Silliman, Dr. Ashamari, thank you for having given of your time this afternoon. And thank you for your excellent briefings. We were delighted to hear from you, and we were very happy to have you with us today, and we hope to be able to meet with you again, that you will be healthy, and that we'll be able to see you in person in the near future. Thank you. I hope to see you very soon. And without further ado, I'd like to thank our technicians as well. Without further ado, we will move on to item 5, the preliminary draft report of the Mediterranean and Middle East Special Group on the future of Iraq, security, stabilization, and regional vocation, presented by our dear colleague Ahmed Berat Jonkar. Before giving him the floor, Berat, I would like all of those who would like to ask questions to request the floor now. It'll make things easier. So please, you have read the report and you can find it on the Documents tab on the right-hand side of the screen, but please request the floor now if you wish to ask a question, and I'll give the floor straight away to Berat.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Sonia, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you for joining us today. I do hope that this will be the GSM's last online meeting and that we will be able to meet in Barcelona later this fall, hopefully. Today, I am happy to present to you the GSM's draft report on the future of Iraq. Iraq is an important country with great potential, but it has clearly and unjustly suffered greatly in recent decades. NATO allies have long recognized this potential and at the request of the Iraqi government have been providing important support through the NATO mission in Iraq. We believe that Iraq can eventually serve as a strategic anchor for the Middle East, one that can potentially reinforce peace and stability in the region, as well as to NATO's southeastern flank. Achieving this vision of Iraq as a strategic anchor, however, is more an aspiration than a reality, and achieving this ambition will require, among many things, the sustained support and the engagement of NATO allies. Without a stable and safe Iraq at the heart of the region, the Middle East will remain beset by conflict and violence. We need to recognize that terrorist organizations could launch attacks from Iraq into neighboring countries. We also need to be mindful that malign international actors like Iran will be tempted to use the country as a springboard to pursue their strategic and sectarian ambitions. The report before you takes stock of the situation in Iraq today and explores the challenges that Iraq must overcome if it is to play a more productive and meaningful security role in the Middle East. This report notes that since 2019, the security situation inside Iraq's borders has improved markedly, but this peace is tenuous and fragile. With the active support of American, Turkish, and NATO advisors, Iraq's main security forces have stabilized the country, and much of the open violence perpetrated by groups like Daesh in the past half-decade has subsided. Iraqi security forces are continuously improving their capacity, are increasingly able to stand alone, albeit with the continued international support. Still, we should not ignore the obvious. Iraq continues to face serious threats, both from within the country and outside of it. Political violence within the country remains a primary concern. Armed militias working only loosely with the government in Baghdad and often with the direct support of Iran are pursuing their own political ambitions while ignoring the will of the Iraqi people. Their actions violate the rule of law, undermine civilian control of the armed forces, and have even led to the assassination of Iraqi citizens. Meanwhile, Daesh continues to destabilize Iraq and harm Iraqi civilians. Although Daesh has been defeated in the field, its ideology continues to attract disaffected groups in the region. Terror attacks in the name of Daesh continue to harm Iraqi communities. Likewise, the PKK, a terrorist organization operating with the support of pro-Iranian militias, frequently launch terror attacks out of Iraq and against targets throughout the region. The PKK defies the security and sovereignty of Iraq and obstructs the implementation of the Sinjar Agreement, all of which threaten the government in Baghdad, as well as the regional governments. Beyond political violence, Iraq's persistently weak economy poses another, more long-term threat to the country's stability. Iraq's overly status economy remains fragile and unable to generate sufficient work opportunities for the population. The country has not enjoyed any sustained period of economic prosperity for almost half a century. Oil revenues, which the government has traditionally relied on to fund essential social services and job creation, remain low, and Iraq's capacity to extract its oil reserves is also limited. Corruption remains rampant and undermines the development. Political violence, low oil revenues, and public sector corruption have all blocked the emergence of a diverse and resilient economy. As a result, unemployment remains high, especially amongst the young Iraqis. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has amplified all of Iraq's weaknesses at the worst possible time. Reconciliation among Iraq's many ethnic, religious, and social groups remains elusive. Sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia, Arab and Kurd, and between the larger sects and smaller groups like the Turkoman, Yezidis, and Assyrian Christians remain serious today. A genuine respect for human rights has yet to materialize in Iraq, and without it, there will be a potential for small political incidents to erupt into more contentious and violent disputes. While Baghdad has tried to foster a greater national identity, one that moves beyond sectarian identity, these efforts are still in their infancy and will require support over the long term. In light of all these political, economic, and social blockages, Iraqi citizens have taken to the street to express their discontent. Iraq's youth have been particularly vocal about the need for reform and change. It is important to recognize that they account for a large portion of the population and are now positioned to effect important political change. Young people are increasingly nationalists and non-sectarian in outlook. They are mobilizing against corruption and unemployment and have strongly pushed for a new political system that better responds to their needs. But while these protests could positively contribute to Iraq's long-term potential and political development, worryingly, they have also been met with fierce repression and violence on the part of both state and non-state actors. To make matters worse, Iraq also confronts daunting challenges beyond its borders. Iran continues to see Iraq as an important component of its strategy to elevate Iranian and, by extension, Shia interests as it defines them throughout the region. It does so by meddling in the international affairs of the neighboring countries. Iran has an entrenched interest in keeping Iraq weak, divided, and therefore pliable. It employs militias and terrorist organizations, including the PKK, for these purposes. This only impedes Iraq's long-term security, stability, and recovery. Likewise, continued instability in neighboring countries like Syria make the eradication of groups like Daesh all the more challenging. As long as Daesh and other groups have space to operate also outside of Iraq's borders, the government in Baghdad will face a compelling challenge to its security. Finally, Russia and China have taken an interest in the region, with Russia heavily involved in neighboring Syria and China increasing its military and economic ties, most obviously with neighboring Saudi Arabia and Iran. Although both countries have maintained a low profile in Iraq thus far, their broader interest in the region is consequential. Iraq's central position within the region means the country will remain on their radar for the long term. This could ultimately complicate Iraq's efforts to achieve greater stability. Overall, then, there are many challenges with which Iraq must contend. It will look to international partners, including NATO and its member states, to reinforce this effort. The NATO mission in Iraq is the most important tool available to the alliance to support Iraq in the long term. To that end, I applaud the decision of NATO defense ministers took in February to expand the mission in Iraq at the request of the government in Baghdad. That important mission operates strictly in an advisory capacity and should help the Iraqi armed forces cope with security challenges at home and abroad, while engaging in capacity building and other long-term initiatives. Indeed, NATO's continued presence in the region will make a distinctive contribution to the government's capacity to conduct military operations, increase public confidence in the state, and help provide the stability needed to improve the investment environment. It would also help Iraq to eliminate those vulnerabilities that have had such a destabilizing impact on the country and the broader region. NATO's mission in Iraq could also help deter Iran from intervening in the politics of Iraq and its neighbors. This, in turn, might help NATO allies revitalize the diplomatic process with Iran, including efforts to revive the JCPOA. In conclusion, I would like to thank the NATO Parliamentary Assembly International Secretariat staff, including Paul Cook, Anne-Laure Blauze, and Pierre de Drozy, as well as the Grand National Assembly of Turkish staff for their assistance in researching and preparing this report. I am looking forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much, my dear Ahmed. Thank you for that excellent presentation. I see that for the moment there has only been one request for the floor, and I would like to ask all of the colleagues to ask for the floor now. Don't be shy. This is an extremely important report. It is highly complex. which raises topics and issues which are fundamental for us. So please do not hesitate to take the floor. And now, my dear, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you, dear Sonia, Madam Chairperson. Dear colleagues, our colleague Ahmed John Carl has presented a report that definitely required hard work to compile and presented us with valuable information and insights. I must particularly stress and commend the reference to the Iraqi Christians' plight, which seldom gets the international attention it deserves. So thank you, Ahmed, for this. Nevertheless, there are some controversial positions in the report, to put it mildly, controversial. Our group, I believe, cannot in a contentious issue adopt positions of a single member state, even more so if the positions are in violation of the alliance's values and principles. The report repeats, in a specific instance, almost mot a mot positions of the Turkish Foreign Ministry on the Turkish military operations in Iraq. In particular, it claims that Turkish operations and military presence in Iraq are justified by its self-defense needs. I'm referring to paragraph 16 and in starting from the sentence that reads, finally, Turkey, a NATO member state, etc., to the end of paragraph 16. Turkey has been using an extremely broad and rather spurious view of the self-defense principle in various instances, not only in Iraq, but in Syria and even as far away as Libya. Can the alliance and hence our group accept such a view of self-defense? To give just a few examples of Turkey's policy in Iraq. In August 2020, 2 high-level Iraqi officials were killed by Turkish drones in an air raid. This caused strong Iraqi protests, with the Iraqi government referring the issue finally to the Arab League. A few days ago this year, we had a Turkish airstrike in northern Iraq. In May this year, we had a visit of the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs in a Turkish military base, a base illegally established in Iraq, without getting a prior approval by Iraqi authorities. This caused a strong reaction on the Iraqi part. And let me just read a sentence from the Iraqi Foreign Ministry's website. That will just take a few seconds. It reads that this caused a strong resentment and condemnation of the presence of the Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar in the Iraqi territory and meeting with Turkish forces that are illegally present, please note, illegally present there without coordination or prior approval by the relevant authorities in Iraq. This is a quote from the Iraqi Foreign Ministry's website on the 3rd of May this year. Now, give me a second to go back to my notes. We enter very dangerous ground here if we condone the violation of Iraq's sovereignty and breaches of international law in such a way. How dangerous the ground is can be seen more clearly if, in addition to the military operations, one examines certain other aspects of Turkish policy in Iraq. Turkey has been presenting itself as protector of Turkomans, who are indeed a minority in danger, but they have been handing out Turkish IDs to Turkomans, and Turkey has been funding schools for Turkomans where only the Turkish language is taught, not the Arab language. Now, with issues related to Arab countries, we must be particularly careful because we absolutely need their support in projecting peace and stability in the region and the world at large. We definitely need them in the fight against ISIS and in general against terrorism, especially terrorism organized by Islamic fundamentalist networks. By approving a report which justifies without any reservation Turkey's violations of Iraq's sovereignty, we would do our part in alienating Iraq, in alienating Arab countries for that matter. In the same paragraph, there is a quote that I'd like to read. Although the primary target is Daesh, it should not be forgotten, and then it goes on to describing the situation with PKK. Whenever we refer to Daesh, it must be clear that the primary target is Daesh, full stop. There should be no ground for misunderstandings there. Now, to wrap everything up, I would thus propose that the quote I mentioned in paragraph 6 from the sentence finally Turkey, etc., to the end of the paragraph be omitted from the final report. Otherwise, the report should not be approved, and it would really be a shame because, as I've said in the beginning, it's really otherwise a very valuable report with lots of valuable information and lots of good work. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My dear Manousos, thank you. I'm so sorry. It's just me. I need to learn how to say it. So Manousos, thank you so much for those clarifications. Thank you for the very detailed reading of this very important report. Before giving the floor to Ahmed, I'm going to give the floor to Utku, who has also asked for the floor.
Thank you very much, Sonia, Madam President, and I would like to congratulate Ahmed, my colleague Ahmed Çonkar, for this detailed report. I would like to actually make a comment on our dear Greek colleagues' criticisms. Actually, of course, as Turkey and any country, I guess, in the region, including all the NATO members, would prefer that the Iraqi authorities deal with all the security threat in their own territory. I mean, this is the normal condition for any country. However, in view of the lack of substantial action against PKK and other terrorist organizations, Turkey had no choice but to act on its own initiative within international law. And I wouldn't agree with our Greek colleague that, of course, Iraqi government has from time to time has its opposition, but he can also read from many international reports or press articles that both Iraqi government and also the Kurdish regional government in Iraq are very much uncomfortable with the operations of PKK in the region. They're also uncomfortable. And so Turkey is also cooperating and working both with the Iraqi government and the KRG to jointly deal with this threat. And I would oppose with, if you're talking about this security situation, the headline of the title of the report is The Future of Iraq's Security, Stabilization and Regional Vocation. This means, security means not only Daesh. Of course, Daesh is one of the biggest threats, but any terrorist organization, name it PKK or Daesh or any other organization, is part of this stability scene. So I wouldn't agree with him to leave this part of the paragraph that he mentioned, that we should only focus on Daesh. No, we should focus on all these threats to the stability and peace in this region, in this specific country. And I strongly recommend my Greek colleague to try to talk with the Iraqi government and also KRG, regional government people, how they're suffering from PKK's activities, especially recently in the recent months. So I just wanted to underline this, and increase cooperation between PKK and some other military groups, particularly in the Sinjar region, is also worrisome, and Turkey is also trying to support the full and swift implementation of the Sinjar agreement with the part of the deal. So I just wanted to make a comment on his criticism, but thank you again, Ahmed, for this report, and thank you, Sonia, for this wonderful meeting.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments. There is another request for the floor. So Ahmed, I'm going to ask you to be a little more patient because there are two more speakers. Mr. Philidakis wants to take the floor again, and I'm going to give it to him. And right after that, I'm going to give the floor to Paolo. And I'd like to ask you, my dear rapporteur, to answer all these questions at the end.
Dear Sonia, I'm not going to take too much of your time. Just a clarification on what our Turkish colleague just said. My reference to Daesh, just wanted to put stress on what's happening with Daesh. I did not mean to say that there are no other threats. Neither did I anyhow support PKK's role in the region. But my request to omit the paragraph actually is based on the fact that it wholeheartedly, without any reservations, accepts the Turkish view, mot a mot, as I've said, the Turkish foreign minister's view on why Turkish military operations are justified in Iraq. And this cannot be accepted, in my view, from our group, similarly without any reservations. That's why I asked for a removal of this particular quote. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais donner...
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to Paolo Formentini now for a last question.
Briefly, may we stress the role of Iran in the report according to the new declaration of the newly elected President Raisi that told the press that he won't stop supporting, sustaining Shia militias in Iraq. This is an important point according to me. And if I may, I want also to stress the role of the Italian army in Iraq. It has been a 20-year presence in Iraq, and it will be increased. And the importance of the NATO presence, the training mission, is really something we have to stress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear Ahmed, I don't know if there are any other questions. I don't think so. I'll act as the spokesperson of the other colleagues who couldn't attend today. So if you don't mind, I'll just get back to the first point, which I think is essential. It's essential that Iraq is protected from regional tensions. We have to respect its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. That, of course, is a key point as part of international law as well. And we've stressed, the allies have stressed the importance of that on the 14th of June at the summit. So in paragraph 16, maybe we could use the agreed terms that were used in the summit communique. I think it's paragraph 20 of the communique. Maybe you can have a look at that paragraph 20. I think you've broadened the scope somewhat in some paragraphs. You talked about Turkey and the future of Iraq, 16, 18, 40, 44, 68, 69. These paragraphs draw a parallel between different terrorist organizations, and they are recognized as terrorist organizations, but they're different in nature. And again, if we don't use the agreed language, it might be difficult. So it might be good to use that type of language. And yes, we do think it might be worth reviewing that a little bit in order for the report to be adopted during our next meeting. And just by way of conclusion, I wanted to say that, of course, Iraq is a sovereign state. It's something we always recall. The state has to control the various armed forces. And I want to get back to the summit communique there again. It highlights the need for the NATO mission in Iraq to continue, but in close coordination with international partners and with international players, relevant players. Part of that, the global coalition. So we have the EU that has deployed a mission to support the Iraqi government in the reform of the civil and security sector, for example. So we think it's important to add to point C of part 3 of the report. I'll send you my comments in writing, because the NMI, the NATO mission in Iraq, of course, shouldn't duplicate the work done by other actors, and that's something we say in many other reports. We always, of course, try to avoid duplication of efforts, and I think it's important to specify that in the document. We want to avoid duplicating efforts made by other international organizations, and we want to really contribute to a greater extent as an alliance as a whole beyond the United States and Turkey. So that was me as a spokesperson for other French colleagues today.
La parole, cher Ahmed.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Sonia. First of all, I would like to stress to my Greek colleague that while preparing this report, we are putting our utmost attention with our international secretariat in order to present a view for all NATO allies for a joint position to develop a joint position in dealing with regional issues as well as in the case of Iraq. And I can assure you that we did not take the issue into consideration from the perspective of the Turkish government or the Turkish Foreign Ministry. We are looking from the NATO lens, and all the allies, the NATO allies, should show this solidarity all together against the terrorist threat when a country like Turkey, which is doing great things in preventing the terrorist threats for Europe, for all the NATO member countries as a frontline country with its huge amount of spending and sacrifices. I think it's very reasonable to include in the report the threats the Turkey is receiving from the PKK, which has caused enormous damage to Turkish people for the last 40 years, and it's a recognized, internationally recognized terrorist organization. And the most important principle that we need to abide by is that we should not differentiate any terrorist organization from the others, because the PKK is one of the most brutal and heinous terrorist organizations, and it has in many cases it has attacked the civilians, slaughtered the civilian population with all kinds of methods, terrorist methods. So it is very important for us to include in this report for the stability of the Iraqi government, the regional government, to bring together our efforts to eliminate all the destabilizing terrorist threats from the Iraqi territory. Turkey is doing its own part in its own self-defense, and as we know, they made it very clear that with the agreements with the Iraqi government, when a NATO member country like Turkey receives threats from the Iraqi territory, and if the Iraqi government is not able to stop this threat, the country, Turkey, has all the rights to defend itself and make the effort to prevent this. threat from the NATO borders and from the Turkish borders. So I would like to receive written specific recommendations from yourself and from my Greek colleague to consider to understand better his concerns. But as a general rule, we decided with the researchers and our directors to be fair and balanced in the report, and we will have to include all the necessary important concepts in the report, including the PKK threat. By the way, our colleague from Italy mentioned the role of Iran and the newly elected president, his position on its support on the Shia militias. Of course, it's an ongoing development, a new development, and I will be happy to receive his recommendations and proposals, and I will consider incorporating that to the report, and it will enrich our report. Thank you very much for that. As well for the role of Italian army and other NATO member armies, I am more than happy to include them in a paragraph so that we can make it more visible. And also from your side, Sonia, you mentioned the NATO mission in Iraq and the European Union's positions and the summit communique. These are all issues developing on the ground, and we can, of course, incorporate it to the report. But I would like to emphasize, after the NATO summit, with the allies addressing their concerns to each other and having a positive atmosphere in dealing with many issues, especially the Afghanistan issue. The withdrawal from Afghanistan is a very important, huge issue. So the NATO alliance right now has to be very close in solidarity and in empathy to understand each other and to work together. We are in a position to actually positively improve the situation on the ground to stabilize our region. As we know, there are emerging threats from China, from Russia, and we need to focus our energy on controlling the situation globally and regionally. So I will be happy to receive some written notes from our colleagues to incorporate to the report. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for having answered all questions, for really getting back on all of these comments. So thank you very much for that. One and last person would like to take the floor. Manousos wants to take the floor one last time. So Manousos, you have the floor.
This was probably by mistake. Anyway, I'll send it. I'll send a short note to Ahmed. Since I'm now back, just let me repeat that I do not have an issue on the references to PKK. My issue is that we must be respectful of Iraq's sovereignty. This is the shortest summary of what I said previously. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, dear Ahmed Berat Junkar. Thank you very much for all the answers you provided to these questions and comments. Thank you, Manousos. And thank you for all of you for these very rich discussions. Dear Berat, I think you've taken note of these various comments and contributions. We will send these comments to you in writing, and thank you very much for considering them. I now give the floor, well, I don't know if anyone else wants to take the floor at this stage? No. Very well. No one else wants to take the floor. So thank you very much, dear Berat. We're going to close the discussion on this fifth point on the agenda. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for these very stimulating and useful discussions. Thank you. I suggest we now move to the last point on the agenda. So is there anything else that someone would like to raise? Any other business before we talk about the next meeting, date and location of the next meeting? Our Spanish colleague might want to take the floor. Right, so our dear colleague Zaida Cantero is the head of the Spanish delegation who would like to take the floor now. Just in a few seconds, and she's going to talk about the seminar in Barcelona, I guess.
Muchas gracias, Sonia. ¿Me escucha bien?
Thank you. Sonia, can you hear me? Very good afternoon. As usual, I'll speak in Spanish. I like to speak in Spanish in this forum. First of all, let me wish you a good health, show my regret for the losses and the suffering of many of our colleagues due to COVID. We find ourselves in this situation, and for me it is a great honor to inform you, dear colleagues, that the next physical meeting where we shall meet physically and speak face to face, finally, the smile without face masks, in some cases, will be in Barcelona. Barcelona, as many of you know, is the capital of the Spanish region of Catalonia, next to the Mediterranean Sea, a multicultural town, multiracial city, multi-religious, multi-ethnical. It is indeed a wonderful city with wonderful weather. It's wonderful to stroll its streets. It's next to the beach. So if some of you, dear colleagues, want to take a walk through these wonderful beaches of Barcelona, please do so. It has a wonderful culture to show you, Gaudi architecture, wonderful parks. And the most important thing is that we shall see each other, we shall meet. So this next meeting of the GSM will be conducted with the subcommittee of the NATO. Some of our ministers will take part, the Minister of Defense of Spain, most probably the Prime Minister as well. It will be a meeting, a human meeting, where physical security and health security will be a priority. We have great vaccination data in Spain. In August, more than 60% of our population will be vaccinated. So we have reached this very longed for expectation, this great number of vaccinated people, collective vaccination that will guarantee a certain immunization. So on 19th and 20th of November, Friday and Saturday, except the minors, most of the people will be vaccinated. So, dear colleagues, I do hope that we shall meet there, full delegations, so that we can hold this meeting together, because we have fought this pandemic, and so we can meet in Barcelona, the second most populated town in the Iberian Peninsula, a city which has a lot to offer, and that you will be able to physically enjoy instead of seeing it through the screen. Then on Sunday, if you want to stay, you can visit much more. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. Il n'y a pas de prise de parole. Je pense que tout le monde est bien.
Thank you very much. Nobody's requesting the floor. I think everybody has agreed on everything you said about the beach and enjoying wine, and there's no contradiction. Nobody is against such proposals and such an invitation. Thank you very much, dear Zaida. This seminar will indeed be very interesting, I'm quite sure. Thank you. I thank you and the entire Spanish delegation and everyone who's involved in planning for this seminar, because we know that it requires a great deal of work. I very much look forward to seeing you all in person in Barcelona in November. And we will be inviting regional partners as well, from the Middle East and North Africa. And I hope that they will also, many of them, attend as well. This brings us to the end of our GSM meeting this afternoon, or this morning if you are across the pond. I would like to thank all members for their constructive involvement in our work today. A great vote of thanks as well to our rapporteur, Ahmet Jonkar, for the preliminary draft report and the briefers as well. It was an honor to meet with you today, and on behalf of all of us, I would like to convey our thanks as well to the interpreters. Without them, none of this would be possible. They did magnificent work, kindly says the chair, allowing us to communicate so effectively. I'd like to thank Paul Cook and Anne-Laure Bleuse and Pierre de Dreuzy and all the colleagues from the NPA Secretariat behind the scenes, always reliable and who allowed us to hold this meeting in the best possible conditions. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care in the meantime. Thank you.